Okay, all of these things, we're trying to get everything recorded, so this one is going to be recorded. It's a little scary for me because you are my debut audience. I've never done this presentation anywhere. It comes from the fact that I have another talk that I give a lot called From Mickey to Magoo, the Golden Age of American Animation. And that is the stuff that was in the theaters. And I get to the end of it and people say, I thought you would talk about Bullwinkle. And I said, no, that's the TV age. So I just sort of put this together to try and introduce you. And notice it says big business in the 1960s, because I would love to just stand here and show you clips of your favorite things. But I know everybody has different ones. And I thought Yogi Bugs and Bullwinkle would sort of give you an idea of what the possibilities were. How many of you were in single digits in the 1960s? Okay, so I'm talking to the choir, right? You've seen this stuff. And I think I'm 61, and I was the demographic for this kind of stuff. So I'm going to just start a little. Come on, audio.
How about lights?
The audio isn't going. Hold on just a sec. Oh, that'll be There we go.
Lights.
Lights. Okay, that was from the Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner show. And it looks like Warner Brothers cartoons were the biggie. When I ask people, what do you remember? You get Bugs Bunny all the time. I'm going to show you a bunch of other things as well. This is a picture of me, Easter 1962, with my Casper the Talking Ghost doll. Because it had a little string. You know, everybody else had Chatty Cathy. I had Casper. One of the lines was supposed to be, let's play hide and ghost seek. And it had a problem. It said, let's play goat's meat. But I was watching a lot of cartoons. But that was all on TV. And I want to take you back to what the beginnings of television were. In this case, we see the percentage of US households with television. So in 1950, you only have 9% of the households with a television. But by the time you get to 1978, 98% of households had a TV. And also starting in 1964, the number of color TVs started expanding. I'd like to talk about this year, 1959. If you notice, well, I didn't say there'd be math, did I? The slope of the curve really shoots up. And part of the reason for that is the number of TV stations available. So in 1950, across the whole country, there were only 110 TV stations, and those are going to be in major markets. But within those 9 years, you get 723, which I think just it explodes. And after that, you get even more. Take a look at this. For June 9th, 1948, television came to Boston with WBZ-TV. And it was a big deal. I mean, the Boston Globe had a whole television section so that people could get it. It was T-Day, the day that Boston got TV. And WBZ's still around, right? Yep. So, but this is a big deal. And because we're getting more and more programming on TV, you had to buy a TV. So this is from 1950, a couple years after Boston had it, and this is in the Boston Globe. And you can see, let's see, that big one, the big one, 16-inch pictured television. Isn't that good? And if you look at that Admiral one, the 12.5-inch, it says it's $199.95, only $2 weekly. So I looked it up. I said, you know, well, what does that mean in 2019 dollars, right? How much would you pay for about a 72-inch LED screen these days? A couple thousand maybe, unless you got it on sale? Well, $100 in 1950 translates to $1,042 in 2019. So you're talking about a $2,000 purchase just to get a $200 TV. But there are ads all over the place because things are burgeoning. Today we're used to everything being 24/7. You know, there's just so much stuff. And all those different channels on cable and everything. What's the song? Something about 500 channels and nothing's on? Right. Yeah. Well, in those days, if nothing was on, you saw a test pattern. And the test pattern came on around midnight and came back, TV programming came on at about 6 o'clock in the morning. Well, one of the things is that even though there were networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, they all started up in the 40s. So you could get your news, you could get all kinds of network programming. It was wonderful. But usually that network programming was all in the evening. And then the local stations had to fill in. So that's where you get the local news, the local weather, things like that. But they also had to fill in the time with other programming. And we get a lot of kids programming, filling things in. Uncle Gus was up at WMUR in Manchester. Big Brother Bob Emery was on BZ. Major Mudd was on NAC and Channel 7. And Salty Brine's Shack in Providence on Channel 12. When I was about this age, that picture that you saw of me, that was while we lived on the Cape. So we got Providence. The distance you were from the TV station really determined what you could see because they weren't especially powerful. But all of these guys showed cartoons. It's been very interesting. In preparation for this, I asked people, what did you watch? Did Uncle Gus show cartoons? Yes, Popeye, and Dick Tracy and Mr. Magoo. It was amazing how many people could tell me exactly what they watched. And a lot of these shows, you could actually be on the show sometimes. You know, they had the live audiences, and they were very, very popular. They also usually filled in a time between the end of school and dinner. So if you see Salty Brine's Shack, that was 6:30 for the news, but Salty Brine was on at 6. So this was sort of babysitting in the afternoon. A lot of these things, I said, Popeye, they didn't have a whole lot of new stuff. So they bought syndicated packages from different companies that had been doing the shorts for the theaters. And the big syndication group was Popeye, the Three Stooges, and the Little Rascals. And you'll see a whole lot of times they'll have a show that's what's on. Popeye was tops as the most popular. We also had some shows, Captain Kangaroo, Mr. Green Jeans, that they sometimes made their own cartoons to go on the shows. But not always. They were reproducing things. So here's Popeye. When they were showing these cartoons, they showed all of them. Didn't matter when. So in 1929, that's the first appearance of Popeye in the Funny Pages. He actually wasn't the primary character in Thimble Theater. Olive Oil was. Well, the whole oil family, olive oil, castor oil, and all these different characters. But in one thing in 1929, for some reason they had to go find a sailor, and they come across this weird guy. You know, hey, are you a sailor? You think I'm a cowboy? I mean, he was just kind of this gruff guy. But the Fleischer Brothers in New York City licensed the character, and they adapted him to this fairly familiar one. In 1933. It was actually introduced on a Betty Boop cartoon, and there's Popeye. It is probably has one of the most complex and disturbing racial scenes in it, because they're at a carnival, and there's a point where an African-American person is sticking their head through a canvas sheet, and Popeye and Bluto are throwing balls at him. And it was a fairly common carnival thing in the 30s, but it was sort of like the first time I saw it, I went, are you kidding me? But then he had his own, and he was doing pretty well. He was in black and white until 1943, but in 1936, they started releasing some two-reelers. A regular one-reel was 7 minutes, and a two-reeler was 14. And they did about 3 of these. One was about Sinbad, one was Aladdin, and what's the other one? It escapes me now, but there's a third one. And they made those in color because finally Technicolor was available to them. Disney had locked up Technicolor for 3 years. And anybody who wanted to make a cartoon in color was out of luck for Technicolor, the 3 colors. And they had actually tried one in this 2-color one called Cinecolor So Betty Boop is a ginger, just so you know. It would show in cyan and orange, and Betty Boop's a ginger. But until you got to Technicolor, it really didn't explode. When you get to 1943, the Fleischer Brothers were not as business savvy as the Disney Brothers, and they really went under. And Paramount basically hired all the same animators, and they recalled it Famous Studios. And he got a little facelift here to look more like the sailors in World War II. He was doing a lot of PR. There are also some very disturbing ones, you know, you're a sap, Mr. Jap, and a lot of really disturbing racial things in that, but very popular, very, very popular. By 1960, King Features took over, and these were ones that were made specifically for TV. When you saw Popeye on any of these syndicated things, you could get any of these. So now you can determine how old something is. And I really remember this one's from 1933. They just seem better. And they always started with a particular opening thing on shipboard. But I would watch any of them. They were also syndicating other packages. Harvey Toons, you probably know this guy the best. So later on, you would get syndicated packages of all those other shows under the Casper show. And I don't know if you remember Baby Huey. Probably one that couldn't survive today. There were also Terry Toons, and there were a lot of different characters, but you probably just know these two. And they had their own shows, the Mighty Mouse show and the Heckle and Jekyll show. We also get Woody Woodpecker show, and that's starting in 1957. Also in 1957, we have Gumby and Davy and Goliath. Those were all stop motion. Gumby actually started on Howdy Doody a couple of years earlier than that. And Davy and Goliath was commissioned by the Lutheran Church. A lot of the things that times I saw it, it was on Sunday morning. And the effort was to bring children's programming and having moral lessons, biblical lessons. I liked Gumby better than Davy and Goliath, but hey, there wasn't much on Sunday morning, so I would watch it. We also see, in addition to some of these, we start seeing things that started out as puppet shows. Now, I remember Kukla, Fran, and Ollie, all these things, they were very, very popular. And sometimes they're marionettes. And this particular one, Beanie and Cecil, was one of my absolute favorites. It made the transition into cartoons for TV. I don't know if any of you remember, but at the end of it, it always goes, a Bob Clampett cartoon. And I remember that, well, clearly. We know all these things, right? But I remember that for the name of it, when I started doing the history of animation, especially during the theatrical things, Bob Clampett was one of the Warner Brothers guys that was doing animation over there. And he saw early that he needed to do something different. He saw that television was the thing that was coming along. And he actually bought into Beanie and his pals early, and then transferred it into cartoons. And you notice Cecil the Seasick Sea Serpent. You never see the bottom of him because it's really based on that puppet. They also eliminated a couple of kind of racist characters. You'll see Hopalong Wong up there. Yeah, characters like that disappeared. And one of the things that was really important about this show was brought to you by Mattel. You start seeing some of these major businesses saying, hey, we got kids. We're gonna sell them stuff. So for instance, here's something else. You could get a Beanie Copter. Did anybody else have one? You put it on your head, and the thing would zip up and fly away. Fortunately, the Beanie Copter came with two. And immediately, you know, you lose the first one. And this one, clearly, the person, this is from eBay, somebody had lost the first one. I lost both of them. And a Beanie Copter without a copter is just, we don't care. This other Jack in the Box, that's actually Matty from Mattel. He came in a variety of cartoon formats, but they had toys for everything because they had a captive audience. Here we go with the Warner Brothers people. Most people know about Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner and all those. These seem to be some of the most favorite cartoons. You probably don't know that they came from really old characters. The ones at the bottom, those are the ones we know from TV. But they go way back. And they had been a staple of theatrical cartoons. Because in those days, of course, you know, you'd go to the movies and it was a night. You saw a cartoon, you saw a newsreel, and you saw other shorts. Fortunately, Pixar has brought back the cartoon, but they would have all of these different things, and they started eliminating them because the newsreel was superfluous. Local channels and national networks were bringing you the news. So they started cutting out those things. And even into the 70s, you do see cartoons, but they started falling away because in the 60s, all these cartoons were showing up on TV. The Warner Brothers cartoons, Merry Melodies and Looney Tunes, sent out a gigantic syndicated package. So this is why when you get to see some of those, you saw some amazing cartoons by master animators. And you also saw some other things. Yeah, I know I have 12 pictures up here, but the censored 11, over on this side, Goldilocks and the Jivin' Bears, that's a picture from it on the top. But there are 11 that were censored, but not until 1968. So these particular cartoons were in the syndicated mix. Yeah, wouldn't fly today, would it? It's really hard to find them. If you buy like DVDs and Blu-ray, you might find them, you know, in those extras. And if you look at some of the media today, you'll find that people like Whoopi Goldberg or somebody else, Leonard Maltin especially, will make a statement about some of these cartoons, and they say to not have them or to try to edit them basically is tantamount to saying that this kind of racial stereotype never happened. It's interesting to me because I work at a high school and I'm the advisor to get this, a cartoon club. And that come out, I show them everything. Right now, although right now we're on Avatar, The Last Airbender. Anybody got kids? They've seen it like 5 times. But I show them all kinds of stuff. And every once in a while I say, okay, we're gonna look at some of the worst cartoons ever. And I also tell them, we're going to call out everything we see. And the kids are really good at that. But the amount of blackface, the amount of stereotypes, I mean, you've got Isle of Pingo Pongo and Jungle Jitters. We've got all those stereotypes of, you know, black Africans putting explorers into the pot because they're cannibals. And they're troubling, but they didn't get rid of them until 1968. But in addition to these packages, the syndicated packages, we have people starting to make cartoons specifically for TV. One of the problems, though, is that TV likes a lot of content really fast. When the theatrical cartoons are being made, they could have a couple of months to do one. And it shows because of the amount of detail, the stories, the performances by all of the characters are really good. But they had limitations. So I'm gonna show you a little Crusader. Has anybody ever seen Crusader Rabbit? Oh, wow, this is awesome. So you remember Crusader Rabbit? Part of this thing is it's sort of like a comic book. They take a scene and maybe they'll pan across it or they'll zoom in and there's just minor little things on mouths to show the animation.
Heard the most ferocious sounding roars. That tiger must really be a monster. This has been a transcribed program. Crusader Rabbit knew he'd found the one to help, so he planned the escape.
Tiger, it is I, Crusader Rabbit. The Texans are chasing my cousins, the jackrabbits, out of Texas.
Here they are.
And you got to help me, Tiger. Will you come with me to battle the Texans?
Yeah, I'll do it. And so, having persuaded the tiger to join his forces, Crusader Rabbit and his newly found friend...
Oh, So they go off. So that's the kind of thing. And you can see just occasionally there's a little mouth movement. I love it when they're having a conversation and their backs are to the camera. That makes it even easier because the audio track carried most of the stuff. And there's a little bit, but they could crank these things out. Crusader Rabbit started in about 1950, but they knew that this medium of television was going to take off. The first color cartoon made for TV was Colonel Bleep. Anybody see Colonel Bleep? Ooh, I only found one person on Facebook because I've been asking questions the past couple of days. The fellow who remembered it is on the board of governors for the Oscars. And he just recently retired as the head of the animation department at USC. Yeah, so he was the only one. He remembers it. He grew up in New York City. I find this little clip just amazing. And so this would be in 1957, around the time that Sputnik went up.
The people of Futura had only recently become interested in Earth. To Futurans, the Earth was only a small planet revolving around the minor sun of the Milky Way galaxy, and hardly worth investigation under ordinary circumstances. However, on July 16, 1945, they had observed what appeared to be an atomic explosion on the Earth planet. As time went on, Futuran Futonic radar scopes recorded an increase in the number and fury of these explosions. And in the Earth's stratosphere, even the rocket trails of guided missiles were observed. To Futurans, these were signs of trouble. Trouble in space, and trouble anywhere in space is the concern of the Futura Interplanetary High Command. And so Colonel Bleep has arrived. And the exciting adventures of his new secret mission are about to begin.
Yeah, taking on the concerns of the day. This one I remember, Clutch Cargo, that started in '59. Has anybody seen Annoying Orange? Yeah, you've seen, it's really annoying, isn't it? And they put real mouths on the fruit, and Annoying Orange really is annoying. But it started in 1959 with something called Synchrovox with Clutch Cargo. And I really don't like this clip, but you have to put it in time. And we've got 3 characters, and you'll see their mouths. But this one, every time I look at it, I go, oh, I'm going to cringe on this one again. So.
That's the ranch out. All out.
I see some cowboys.
Could be, Spinner. But there's a far away I can't tell.
Clutch cargo.
Hi. You're just passing over? Thought we'd drop in.
Am I glad to see you? I was just thinking about you. You must have read my mind.
Sure is good to see you, Tex.
A girl?
That's right. Tex, you heard all about Spinner and Paddlefoot. I think Spinner thought you were a man.
I really am glad to know you, Miss Tex. And I think I've changed my mind about being just like you.
Okay. Gender mattered then, too. So, and we have these attempts to make it easier to make the cartoons and produce a lot. And this is kind of an interesting, there's no audio on this. But if we look at this one, Wolfie by Tex Avery, who was one of the most amazing animators, just does the wild stuff. If you remember the movie The Mask with Jim Carrey, at one point he's got this mask on and the eyes go out and he's doing some wild thing. That was based on Tex Avery animation. But when we get to Hanna-Barbera, that's Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera who brought you Tom and Jerry. And they were very successful. They got a lot of Academy Awards, much to Disney and Warner Brothers' dismay. But they decided to go into cartoons for TV. And this doesn't have any audio with it. There we go. In the Tex Avery one, you see performance. You don't have to hear anything to know he's pissed off, right? And it's a whole performance, and each frame is drawn separately. It's gorgeous. No wonder it took them a while to make these things. But the Yogi Bear, if you watch it, you'll see most of the frame doesn't move. It's called limited animation, and they do a lot of loops. When you see Yogi turn his head, do you have any idea what he's talking about?
Picnic baskets.
And we know a lot of these things, because the other part is that Hanna-Barbera repeated a whole lot of things. Everybody, Mr. Ranger, sir, let's get some picnic baskets. You remember that? And they would repeat it. And the thing about picnic baskets was sort of the go-to if you wanted to do impersonation of Yogi. But they were working on this because they could just move little pieces. You'll also find in their anthropomorphic cartoons, the animals tended to wear some kind of collar, bow tie, something. If you start thinking about them all, you're going, oh my goodness. And that's so that they could hide whatever the neck was. These characters don't have necks. It's hidden, so it makes it easier to take that limited animation. And they have different views, but they just keep going back and forth. Now, this is a little later, but their first big show was called Rough and Ready. Has anybody ever seen this one? Good. Oh, wow, you guys are a great crowd. I hadn't. But this is the first one, and Rough and Ready had their own show. They were part and parcel of some of the other TV shows with a local person doing the cartoon stuff. But fairly soon afterwards, we start with the ones that most people know. And the first ones for kids, the Huckleberry Hound Show, Quick Draw McGraw, and Yogi Bear. Actually, Yogi Bear started in Huckleberry Hound. These particular TV shows were based on 3 segments. So you get Pixie and Dixie, you got all these different characters that they had in their, they just got their own. They made new characters. So Huckleberry Hound in the first season, Yogi Bear was one of those segments. And then they discovered he was really popular, so they gave him his own. And I think that's when we get Snagglepuss. But Quick Draw McGraw, I don't know if you remember him. You know, Baba Louie was his sidekick. You know, Quick Draw. You never get away with that either anymore. So they made a whole lot of things that were ethnic because that got laughs. And I also, when we Quick Draw McGraw, El Kabong, he had a mask and he had a guitar and he'd bang the bad guys with his guitar. He also somehow in the middle of the desert had something he could swing in on and sort of take off on some of the strange characters that we saw. Anyway, who's the one who would do that? Zorro. It was a takeoff on Zorro. Within a short period of time, though, they started making full half-hour situation comedies, and that's when we start getting the Flintstones. And the Flintstones was not targeted for the between school and dinner crowd. It was targeted to adults, and it aired at 8:30 at night. If you think about The Simpsons and things like that, we still have adult half-hour situation comedies. The Flintstones were a takeoff on The Honeymooners, right? But it takes place in prehistoric times. Kind of interesting there, but you could listen. The thing about those is you could listen to them and tell what was going on. It was just, you could just listen, because the animation wasn't really compelling. You know, you might see Fred with his bowling ball, things like that, but that wasn't really the part. What made the Flintstones funny was they had all these strange things, like the woolly mammoth with his trunk coming in to wash the dishes, and the bird that would be on the record player. And all those visual jokes, all those gags, were really why you watched the Flintstones. Next we have Top Cat. Top Cat was also an evening program, and that was a takeoff on the Phil Silvers show, because Phil Silvers was this guy who always had some kind of scheme going, a little posse of people, and they're always trying to get around Officer Dibble in this one. So he's always kind of scheming. And then we get to the Jetsons, and the Jetsons are like the Flintstones, only in the future. And once again, you could tell what's going on from the audio, but the funny part of it is the gags and what they thought was going to be in the future. And so every time I see the video calls coming up, a lot of times people said, oh, we'll never have that. Well, yes, we do. I have my phone, I can do it. Jetsons wasn't on for very long, but it was very popular. A lot of these shows, especially Flintstones, Top Cat, and Jetsons, ended up migrating to Saturday mornings as well. We don't necessarily see Huckleberry Hound, Quick Draw, and Yogi spending much time on Saturday mornings, but the other longer ones. And of course, then in Hanna-Barbera, they just keep going. They make all sorts of characters, too many to even put on this screen. And every time you turn around, there's a new character. Or they have the wacky races, and then you have the perils of Penelope Pit Stop. Everything they could come up with just to make something new. And it was pretty easy. All they had to do was somebody design new characters, and they could do this limited animation. So they also did a lot of toys. And these are called TV Tinykins, 98 cents. You wouldn't believe how much they cost on eBay now. This is Hokey Wolf. These things are about this big. And the reason I know about Hokey Wolf is that we lived on the Cape, and my dad had a little outboard motor boat, and he named it the Hokey Wolf, and he bought one of these specifically. And Hokey Wolf's sidekick, because I always had a sidekick, right, was Ding-a-ling. So my dad's rowboat to get out to his boat was Ding-a-ling. Yeah. Well, but this idea of having all this stuff that goes along with the cartoons, this really made sense because they were marketing to kids. You could find little records. That one on Mighty Mouse, anybody remember Andy Kaufman on Saturday Night Live? He put this record on, "Here I come to save the day." And anything that was on there, I mean, the Alvin Show, they were singers, right? So I remember having some of these with Huckleberry Hound. I mean, these are things that I owned. So they were marketing to my parents, me, and getting my parents to get these things. Another thing that they started doing was comic books. Now, before that, there were a lot of comic books out there with the characters from any kind of animation, but not the animation, the regular stories. You know, you get Superman, all those heroes. But once you start getting into the 60s, and there are all these things that are showing up on the screen, Dell and Gold Key grabbed them and made comic books with them. I mean, does anybody remember Clyde Crash Cup? Oh, I got a no on that one. Okay, cool. Calvin and the Colonel? Calvin and the Colonel is really kind of another one of those sketchy ones. All of the voices and all of the stories are based on Amos and Andy stories. By this time, it really wasn't okay to be putting African-American people in that, especially Amos and Andy. But so they made a fox and a bear, anthropomorphic. That was one easy way to get out of it, was making animals do this stuff. But they have the same Southern accents. In addition to these, there were all sorts of other things. And this is Soaky from Colgate-Palmolive. And this was for Bubble Bath. But afterwards, you got to keep the character. And this company was amazing. They licensed so many different characters. And, well, here we go. Here's an ad for Popeye and Bluto.
Toy too, Popeye.
Well, blow me down. It's his sweet self.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah! You asked for it! Soapy clean and the ocean's full of fun.
Scrubbly, bubbly, flippity, blubbity.
Clean before you're done.
Soapy clean and every girl and boy
Gets a toy when it's empty,
it's a toy.
Look for the new Popeye and Brutus Soaky toys.
Takes a soaky fun bath today.
It's fun.
More fun than getting dirty.
Yeah. It's really interesting how many people say they have one. I mean, the Smokey Bear, I just had somebody tell me this morning, oh, my mother had that one. They had the Beatles. I mean, Colgate was really good at marketing all these things. So you had all these different characters that were available. There were a lot of toys for the Flintstones. I put these up, the bowling set. I had it. I think it's somewhere in my parents' summer house. I had the Fred Flintstone Bop-'em thing. And then this strange little set here. You put things together, it was plastic. I had one of those. And yes, I had Flintstones vitamins. This was when they started, when Pebbles came around, they started aiming it toward kids. And the ad executives looked at what gender the Flintstones baby was going to be. And they picked a girl because dolls. They figured they could sell dolls. But this was quite a different thing from when the Flintstones started at 8:30 at night.
The Flintstones has been brought to you by
Ah! Yeah, had to switch that one. That was in the age where a company would sponsor a whole show rather than having cartoons. There was also a Flintstones camping resort in South Dakota. It lasted for about 50 years. It closed in 95. There's gonna be 2000, no, not 95, 2015, so it was pretty recent. It was in South Dakota. There was also one in Arizona from 1972 until January. And they had all sorts of weird things. I didn't know this. I mean, we knew Disneyland, but Hanna-Barbera was working on it. One of the other things that started in the 60s were Christmas specials. So the very first one was Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, and that was very popular. And these things were an hour long. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, which I think is one of the creepiest of the Christmas Carol, Christmas specials. I mean, Hermie wants to be a dentist. You know, this all fits into the island of misfit toys and things like that. This was put together for $500,000, and it was animated in Japan. So, but who's the sponsor? GE. And they really marketed with that. Here are some GE clips that were made for their advertising with the various elves. So there's not a star on the top of the tree, it's a GE logo. There seems to be an elf that is vacuuming. And I don't know, I'm a little disturbed by this elf that's in the toaster oven. You know, but they're really leveraging all these cartoons because they're engaging. We have the Charlie Brown Christmas. This is 1965. So a lot of these things, here's the Grinch, 1966. The classics, the ones we say is classics at Christmas, all came out of that 60s thing. Now, the other part is, and I'm going to show you some things you probably haven't seen, but cereal. I almost called this talk sugar, actually. Sugar and plastic. So we saw all these plastic things. Here are some of the ones for Post cereal. I'll go a little bit of it and go on.
Brought to you by Post, makers of Post Treat Pack, just for kids. 6 sweet treats that start your day a little bit better.
You get Yogi.
Hey, new Kellogg's Okays. Note the improvement? They put a bear on the box, which improved it so much, they decided to improve the cereal, too.
Oh, come on, Yogi. Let's be serious about Kellogg's new Okays, okay?
Like the Space Bears say, hey, okay.
Well, first, how nutritious are Kellogg's?
Oh, yeah, how are they? Let's go to Bullwinkle.
Unless, of course, one's got the go to spin about.
And smart belly folk get their go with Cheerios. Tasty, toasty O's of oats. The grain with the most protein and vitamin B1. More than corn. More than rice. More than wheat.
Cheerios builds up muscles. Or, if you're a moose, moosels.
Tennessee Tuxedo.
Sorry, Baldy. Frosty-O's are for breakfast. Frosty-rific snacking, too.
Shaped like sugar frosted donuts.
Top Cat. This is an early one.
Heel and toe, and away we go with the Kellogg's Cornflakes. Dozy-do. Kellogg's Cornflakes. Do you eat cornflakes? Corniest flakes. Anybody makes it. Kellogg's.
So one of the things is these commercials were showing in the middle of the shows. So you'd be watching a cartoon and then the same characters would come out with an advertisement. Hey kids, tell your mother you want Kellogg's Cornflakes. This is Yogi Bear. Little bit problematic, but there were also cartoon characters that were developed specifically to sell stuff. We have, there we go.
Rising out of the great carrot patch, paradise for any rabbit. Except me, you see.
I like Trix better than carrots. Trix, the corn cereal. Of natural fruit. Fruit colors, too. Those crispy Trix fruit colors make me a happy fellow. There's
Tricks are for kids, right? Then, remember this guy? Yeah. Why isn't this loud? Nope.
Morning already, Cedar. Where's the crew? All hands on deck.
Now, these were things that were designed specifically for the products. There wasn't a Captain Crunch show. As a matter of fact, they made the cereal and gave it a name, Captain Crunch, and they had the people from Rocky and Bullwinkle, the Jay Ward studio, create the characters. Come on.
Hi, I'm
Tony the Tiger.
Kellogg's Sugar Frosted Flakes and their
Looking at the time.
Before your very eyes, the Quaker Oats Company will now introduce
There we go.
new cereals. I'm Crisp, the crisp new cereal from outer space. The biggest selling cereal from Saturn to Alpha Centauri.
There was also Quake. Quisp still exists, I'm told. I'm looking at my time. It's lunchtime, isn't it? The way you would find out what was on TV was you would look in the newspaper. And here we go. That was what it was in 1960. Just that many. And these are the cartoons you could see on Saturday morning. Popeye Theater, cartoon time, where they would just put anything, Heckle and Jekyll and Rough and Ready. But when we get to 1965, it's a little bit longer. This is part of the parade section from the Boston Globe on Sundays, so they'd have everything for the week. And that was really exciting. I go until I get to Saturday. And in 1965, we get this many. As we go even farther, there are like 30 or 40 cartoons available. Anybody see any you like up here? Remember Hoppity Hooper? Underdog? Underdog was actually owned by General Mills. Yeah, the people who made Underdog were hired, and it was owned by them, and Tennessee Tuxedo. We also start seeing some cartoons after school that came from Japan. Tezuka Osamu made some just amazing films, and he did Astro Boy and Kimba the White Lion and Speed Racer. But a lot of these things that you see, when I asked people where they saw them, they were on that UHF channels. Remember, we're expanding the number of channels. We have to have content in them. And these tended to be on those channels. So you were a little cooler if you'd seen them. TV Guide. It's amazing what you can get on Etsy. What are your children watching Saturday mornings? This is from 1968. By 68, we were getting rid of some of the cartoony things. Of course, Bugs was still on. But you start seeing Herculoids and superheroes, Spider-Man, things like that. And there was a concern about what that was, what are your kids watching? And then the next year in 69, Children and TV, they were starting to get interested in that. And then we have the Children's Act for television to constrain the number of minutes of advertising in that time. But there was also a concern about violence. I'm sorry, this is not quite as sharp as I wanted, but one cannot, of course, single out TV as the sole contributor to violent behavior, nor can one single out cartoons. Both are part of a broad spectrum, which has made a fetish of violence. And that's one of the big concerns, isn't it? That all this nastiness was coming along. So, yeah, I'm doing okay on time, I think. Almost there. So this is the end of the talk. Thank you. And thank you for being my first audience for this. I had a lot of fun just going through this, and you won't believe how many slides I just skipped. It would go on all Saturday morning. So I know you're ready for lunch, but if anybody has, if we have a couple of questions, that's okay, or just going to lunch is fine.
The picture of Quiz
Yep.
reminds me that in my family, it was one, I liked Quiz, one of my brothers liked Quake.
Yep.
And it was set up, I remember at some point it was actually set up as a competition to which one
Yes.
you were gonna buy, so it was as if it was, and I realized, you know, I didn't think about it then, but it was as if it was a marketing scheme.
Absolutely.
Buried within the marketing scheme, so that you're actually not going outside of whoever that manufacturer was to create an opportunity to buy more.
Right, because you don't want somebody buying a Kellogg's cereal and somebody doing Quaker Oats.
Right.
You keep them in there. I was a Quake person, I lost.
I won.
I became a fan of Rocky and Bullwinkle in my 20s.
Oh, wow.
And what